honor to introduce Erin Wilkinson. Erin is an associate professor at the University of New Mexico and the Department of Linguistics. Prior to that, she got her master's degree from Wesley College, her BA degree, and she attended Gallaudet University for her master's degree in linguistics. And then she attended the University of the University of New Mexico, and she received her PhD also in linguistics. Erin has done a lot of really interesting and important work approaching the theoretical to applied issues related to sign languages. She previously worked with Jill Morford, and she did a lot of exciting work with cross-language activation in ASL and English. She also worked with Sarah Taub on conceptual and coding some complex event structures in American Sign Language. She's been a major support major contributor for working with Ryan Lepic, and also working with Corinne Orciano on iconicity in American Sign Language. Also, she's working on ASL phonetics. And she's examining undershoot and ASL with Kevin Russell.
I'll take it.
I'm so sorry. And she's also studied in Norway and in Rome. Her own work really focuses on linguistics and anthropological descriptions in sign languages in the deaf community. From cognitive functional perspective. And her work is on pronouns. It's very interesting, and it's working on reflexive pronouns, using this handshake to indicate a person's self. And the sign self has both reflexive and emphatic functions. Her work has really brought really strong analytical methods and academic approaches, and really she's a rising star in sign language linguistics, and she is one of the young Turks in the field. So we're really honored to welcome her to LSA here. So please welcome with me Erin Wilkinson. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. I think it's a little bit overly nice, but I always enjoy any accolades that people give me. Anyways, I am so excited to be here at the Linguistic Institute because it's my first time here in a while, and I've just really enjoyed sitting in different classes, and it's just so interesting. I've learned so much. It's so impressive. You are very lucky to be here. Anyways, I know that our time is limited for this presentation to just about 1 hour to present my topic. And before I get started, I have to admit I missed, a lot of you, I know there's some of you who know sign language, and I know a lot of you don't. But prior to jumping in, I really want you to think about your own work, whether it's theoretical, applied, or it's specific methods of analysis. But languages that you work with. And I think about how much that you just don't think about the modality. Okay, but think of that modality. So maybe many of you don't think of that, but I'd like to introduce it, just to put it out there for you to consider, because people who sign, have kind of entrapped with that concept of analyzing sign language based on what modality and specific principles. And that is a problem within itself. Actually, this is my dissertation from a long time ago, and I am honored to discuss it again because I think it's very beneficial, and it also reminds me about how much work has happened thus far within the field of sign language. I mean, it is very exciting to see that expand, and also considering about, some theoretical approaches, and, just that we continue to face in the field of linguistics. And so I really hope that you enjoy this presentation. Well, first off, what we will be discussing about is, different categories, but in general, really we have to discuss the concept of markedness. Languages, have a long tradition of describing what markedness means in those languages. But with sign language in general, it's very limited. There has been maybe some discussion, especially related with phonology, but really other than that, there's nothing. And so we wonder, how can we discuss different categories of sign languages, considering, it's a very big question of what the criteria is for typological markers in ASL. So, who knows sign language here? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so some of you sign like this, so like not so well, and that's okay. So if you think about how we can easily define what structure and complexity in sign languages, can we easily discuss that? Okay, good, because the answer is no. We have no idea about how we can even start that discussion. What is structure and structural complexity in itself? I mean, we could have 10 people in the room, and we could have 10 different answers, and we could walk out and have some wine and enjoy the rest of our evening. However, in all seriousness, again, we can go round and round of how do we discuss markedness if we don't know how to define structural complexity. Do we see a problem? Again, another problem, and another problem. So that go-around is just this spiral, and it's very common in sign languages. There are a few of us, and I know who you are here, and we are just stuck because we're just saying, we want to jump in, we want to try something, and that's fantastic, but we need to be more aware of what exactly we're jumping into and what type of assumptions we're bringing when we jump in and into what findings we will have. And this is just a quick bit of background information. And again, sign languages, the research is just, it's still so minute in explaining and the notation, and it's not well understood. So, as you can see on my slide, sign languages and communities, I just want you to understand, more of the characteristics. It's spontaneous, and it emerged independently, and it disappears when they merge. And this happens all over the world, and it's very interesting properties about sign language compared to spoken languages, because these occurrences that, are not as stable as we see it in spoken languages. and what type of linguistic structures we typically see in those sign languages. We have more discussion about like types of communities, and maybe you've heard about, maybe in other classes, or maybe you've read about, like for example, in the majority of sign language communities, what type of structure we see as far as grammar systems, and in minority sign languages, in cities, suppose, the language is not as majorly used with the community as we think. Maybe there's just a emergent signer in a large city, and what that means and what the structure looks like. And more broadly, we would mostly is communities in rural settings. Maybe there's like a mix of deaf people and hearing people, and they have their own system of sign. There's a lot of discussion that has been ongoing about those types of categories, and they're wonderful, but we haven't really approached what is structural complexity, what is markedness, what are those?
Most importantly for all of you, what I'd like you to do, whatever work you're involved in right now, I'm sure is absolutely wonderful. But I do think it's a little bit odd that it just keeps continuing to happen with signers, that we must know everything about spoken language and what kind of things are discovered within spoken languages. But sign language, the modalities or modality independence or dependence, those things are quite different, and we don't seem to look at sign languages when we want to talk about modalities. So there seems to be a mismatch with that. So if we understand the concepts of modality dependence and the kind of things that happen within that when we're looking at that with sign language and spoken language, what can we see that's universal with both of those modalities? So we really haven't yet addressed that when it comes to modalities. We keep looking at modality, but the problem is we need to have an awareness, and I want you to think about that when you're doing your own research and work. Now, kinship terminologies. All right, so I am in the past, as a PhD student, I was thinking, oh, well, I think this is going to be a fabulous idea for my dissertation. I will look at this kind of structure, the complexity, and then I will look at this big question as it relates to signers. And really, I didn't find the answer in my dissertation, I'll tell you that already. But when I look at kinship terminologies, I needed to pick something that I could look at within cross languages, across various languages. And I thought, well, kinship terminology, all languages have that. And so if I looked at Greenberg, and many of you maybe are familiar with his work, he started with spoken languages and developed the idea that languages in general, they're universals, and that I could take some of those universals and bring that right over to the study of sign language. Now, we have to understand something here. We're here in the United States. We use American Sign Language, so you realize that American Sign Language is really poorly investigated as a language. And we think about all the other sign languages that are out there throughout the world, they're even less investigated and researched. So we really need to challenge ourselves and figure out how we can analyze those universals with sign languages, all the various ones, and identify what we can see universally across languages. And let me tell you, that is a tough process. So what can we do? What I did is I picked various languages throughout the world, and just because I'm fascinated with those languages was not really the reason. I couldn't do it that way. What I was trying to do is kind of do a balance, which was really tough because I know it's limited to what I could actually access. So altogether, I studied 40 various sign languages. And so you can see all the various places on the map there, the Americas, Europe, Asia, but really 40 sign languages. That's such a small number. You know, I have a lot of work yet to do. But what I was trying to see, and what could I glean from that? And I did see many interesting things that I'd like to share with you tonight. Now, before I start this discussion, I just kind of want to put it out there. How do we analyze language when we're looking at structure? Well, I'm going to give you a very simple and very brief description of the signs. And just basically, you can just read, any person can read a sign language book. But sign language can be based on 3 various aspects: hand shapes, location, and movement. There's more, but I don't want you to be concerned with the remaining aspects. So we typically call those hand shapes, location, and motion, we call that phonology. So we do have some problems with that. We can talk about that part later. But I do want to show you just a short clip here. This is Turkish sign language. Okay, simple. We can see handshake, thumb up. We can see where it's located on the chin. Okay? So, and the motion, tapping it twice. Now, again, I would like you to recognize something very important. Sign language itself is not just like a 1, 2, 3 thing that we can talk about in terms of language and phonology. You know, it's very expansive. There's so many complexities to it. And so we had to decide how we were going to divide things up and classify and label things in a way that would give it meaning. And so we looked at form and function. And so it's very thick and dense. And so I did need to use a book. And that's not really the best way to really truly understand language. But I had to figure out some method that I could handle languages that I didn't know. So I do want to let you know that's a limitation of my study. Now, so sign. So maybe you're all looking at me and you see that I'm signing away up here. Well, I'm also using these various aspects of sign language. And remember, it's very expansive, all the different aspects here. And this is, we're trying to talk about, you know, units of language here. So this is, you know, I don't expect that all of you are learning all of these aspects of the language. However, I am very, very accustomed, and I tend to jump ahead. But this work, I do want to let you know, is very complex because we had to be, conscious of various issues related to phonology and morphology. And we had to know that with sign languages, morphology, well, there's not a lot known. So it's very limited discussion related to morphology out there in the linguistic world. So we saw more discussion out there, but we had to decide, well, okay, what are we going to do? Phonology, morphology, these are big theoretical questions that we just analyze out there. Secondly, semantics. We had to take a look at that, which was very interesting. And we hear it again and again, but the discussion really, if you look at the image schemas, if you look at the metonymic schemas as well as the metaphorical schemas out there, and that's what forms the structure. These are the parts that we're looking at regarding structure. And then lastly, down here, we're looking at form, function, mappings. And you're going to be able to see that iconicity, the image, the arbitrariness, and sometimes I do see there some derivation, semantic derivation that goes on within the language use. So I know I'm really touching on this very quickly to get through my talk, but I do want you to really just instinctually understand that there's so much out there in this with regard to sign language. So I'm just trying to throw out some various ideas that I found very interesting as I was looking at these 40 sign languages, and specifically kinship terminology. So maybe one or two terms, that's what we were looking at. Because, I understood there was some bias that we needed to account for in terms of the terminology, and I'm going to tell you that I was really surprised because the highest Nepali were 58 terms for kinship. So I know any of you who are aware of and know some sign language has to be surprised to see that. Secondly was Mexican with 46, then Indo-Pakistani, Karachi with 43, and Chinese with 37. They have a lot of kinship terms. And then when we looked at the lowest number of kinship terms in a sign language, it was Croatian with 6, Persian, and then Mandarin. So really, if we had looked at the dictionary itself, it would show us that there were just few words. The dictionary, though, didn't really explain everything about the function of the terminology, so we never knew exactly how they were using the terminology. I know that language use in my family is Turkish. I see how we are using language, and it's not the same way as it's used in spoken language. And so if you're talking about vocative function, how many of you are paying attention, if the 5-year-old boy screams out, "Mom!" Okay, if you have kids, you know what this means, "Mom!" Well, if you're deaf, you don't scream out, "Mom!" No, why you don't? Because the moment I look over there, you got my attention. Yeah, right? Am I right here? So vocative function, it has a specific meaning and use. And for deaf signers, they don't use that. But how do in kinship terminology? That's really, I need more study about that, and if you're any students out there, I need you to help me with that. I'm just going to throw it again. There's a few fun little facts here and pictures and videos here, but I would like all of you to notice one thing. So this is Tibetan sign. So there are 4 pictures, and do you think they look the same? The answer's no. As you can see, each one's ant. It's showing the different relationships here. So this is the sister of the father, the sister of the mother. So, very interesting. It depends on how, whether it's paternal or maternal relationship there, and then looking at uncle. This is so interesting to me. And I think that's an important question for all of us to look at, because when we talk about ASL, so the sign for uncle, and that is a classificatory term, uncle. So U plus, it's here at the top of the head. Male signs typically are at the top of the head. And so my mother's brother, or my father's brother, my aunt's husband, or whatever. You know, that's it. That's the one sign that we have for uncle. But look at this, it's very specific. I thought this was fascinating.
And now in Nepal, what we see it's more interesting is it gets even more complicated with family lineage. It's just saying, I'm sure it happens also with spoken languages, but what is more interesting to us, for those of us who sign, is to, if you just take a look at the top row, there are 3 different parts. It seems, you know, the lexical units, as you can see. And then if you compare the bottom ones, there are 2 lexical units. However, you know, the actual structure is quite different. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start with the bottom. It's the easiest. If you look at the one on the left, there's first is gender, you know, female or male. And then also the individual handshake is represented, the initialized handshake, excuse me, in Nepal Sign Language. And then if you look at the top 3, it seems like it's referring to, you know, size and then mother and father. So I think the structure is different. So, and that's what I'm more interested in, is the structural complexity. What's more marked? What do you think is more marked? You know, the commonality of spoken language is, you know, the fewer parts means the less complicated, the less marked. But intuitively, people say, well, if we see an initialized handshake that represents a part of speech, you know, that's related to the written form, and that's the markedness. But how do we solve that conflict? And I personally have no idea, but this is what I mean that should be discussed: structural complexity and markedness. So I want to understand about Greenberg's proposal. But when I look at sign languages, it seems that there is not really a match. I mean, there are some parallels that exist, but I mean, others seem to be sort of a mismatch. And sign languages seem to have a different way of organizing the structure within a system. And that can mean that markedness somehow, you know, it sometimes becomes more apparent. And I'm sorry, we don't have a lot of time to get into a lot of this, but I did want to touch on these things that, you know, should you be aware of the history related to genetics and language, or borrowing, or agreement, and does this just happen? I mean, that's the other thing I'd like to discuss, is the sharing of symbols that, you know, we will discuss and relate it with iconicity. You know, in sign languages, there is very little that is documented. We have, you know, very limited understanding about the contact, you know, and genetics and borrowing, and it's so limited. And we're not able to really answer these questions very well. And so now the concept of markedness in language, is really easy to show us. What is English? You know, sister and sister-in-law. We can see, you know, there's sister, and then sister-in-law has that additional counter distinction. So if you consider, I don't mean this, but I mean more broadly, it could be, sister can mean a girl's sibling or a boy's sister. So, I mean, it can be quite broad of what the actual lexical unit means. And then if we look at it from another lens of the structure, and we can see there's a difference with the properties of it comparing age, gender, and Nepal they say mormor, which they would say the word mormor, that means the mother's mother. And then in Italian, they would only know his, grandparents as a female. And then grandmother that would be from, the parent itself. So, but that's very simple. And so, in general, the definitions in spoken language and categories are unmarked terms. There's no structural coding, and then there's more distinctions and high frequency. And then in marked terms, has more overt structural coding, less distinctions, absence of distinctions, and typically are less frequent. Those are the basic defining characteristics. Now I'd like to show you some examples of structural coding. And this is in Japanese sign language, the sign for grandparent. We do see old male, and that expresses the arbitrariness. And old female is something like this, and it's showing gender differently. The hand shape versus the pinky versus the thumb up, and also grandchild. That's second generation. The grandparents, but it does not include gender. So that's the type of match I was talking about in Greenberg's study, that pattern. So I find that quite interesting. So this is a Turkish sign language, and they have two signs. For example, for an older brother, there is a sign like this, and that's showing brother who is older, like this from the thumb going up from the chin, and older male, and then this one signing, which means sibling, which can mean older or younger brother, and it can also be used for older, younger sister. So age is marked and younger, so it fits with Greenberg's findings. This one I found fascinating, and I can never figure this out. It is so complex with the kinship, with Korean Sign Language. So what is more important about this is the use of two hands. So you have one tongue, and then two hands. But this one, is using two hands. They're taking advantage of the multitude of information that they can express simultaneously within an occurring sign. So, for example, with the top left picture, with the pinky indicating female, and like this, indicating older, or sibling of the female. And that is just fascinating because it's just interesting to distinguish in Korean sign language using two hands to indicate a relationship as well as gender. It's just fascinating. In Korean sign language, the sign for cousin, you look at this. I don't know what the distinction is for fingers, but it's just fascinating. Like, wow. Like, now I'm starting to wonder about what is the role, in characterization, representation, in language, compared to a written system, and what that means, what does that symbolize? One discussion I think, the one thing I think is important to discuss is an Admiralty sign languages that have been discussed maybe 30, 40 years. And, they've documented them compared to, but, it's an old language of maybe 300 or 400 years old in West Africa. And what's more is that the signs for A younger sibling, as shown here, is a movement behind the back. Sibling, that means, it could be older, it could be, it's quite simple. It's meaning it's the same. This movement of two fingers showing it's the same. So older would be more general, would have more specific than the younger, but we find evidence that the younger is more specific than the older. So that's that. So this means to borrow from the traditional definition of market and unmarket categories from spoken languages may not be appropriate to apply to sign languages. We're considering all these things, and really it's very difficult because as we figure out the different categories, we have to also determine the structural complexity and markedness, and how do we get to that? So the next thing I want to discuss is in regards to iconicity. We have people who are teaching about iconicity. I mean, that word, I believe, is just one of the most misunderstood terms in the field of linguistics. However, maybe we can discuss that with professors, but why, this high pattern of prevalence of iconicity, we were thinking about, we're humans, we have layers of experience that we all share and commonalities. So looking at this, in terms of eyes, we're not that different, we vary, but physically and features, and languages can use those features, those universal signs. So those universals, the human experience. And if you think about maybe like holding a baby or talking about a child or a birth. So, like talking about a birth, do humans, birth babies out their mouths? No. I think that we are already aware that humans, we all kind of give birth in the same manner. And of course, we can use that, we can take advantage of that, the abstractness. But, if we're talking about a child, they're growing up, so we have those features of growing from going from short to tall, we're not like Benjamin Button, where you go in reverse from tall to short. So, so there are variations, but it comes down to it's the limit. I don't like that word limitation. However, but specifically the universal human experience, there's not much variation, and that makes sense. Okay. Now I'd like to talk about culture. And again, this may be a little bit confusing. I have traveled to many different places. It's just interesting how many people just assume that, this is obvious. And I'm like, no, I don't understand this because obviously I'm confused. So that should be obvious. So it's like then when someone says, okay, when you figure out it is obvious, but I haven't yet had that experience. I'm not from that culture. I don't have that framework. Once I get into that culture and I learn the framework, it can become more apparent. So do we all share the same cultural framework? We don't. And so some people's cultures just are, a little bit more varied and subtle, and there's a lot more variety along with culture and different specific properties. I want to emphasize this idea of transparency. It's not like, oh, well, it is what it is. No, it's based on people and their experience and interpreting their understanding. It's not the variable, but
interesting thing that I have noticed in terms of terminology with kinship. And that is really about location. Right now, I really don't have, here we have this, the pinky and the thumb, and I've worked really hard to look at how that's culturally indicated, women and male signs. Well, really, it's not that obvious to me, but it does seem that in ASL, if we look, we can see that male signs typically are at the forehead and female signs are below the nose. So this is what we see. If we look at Danish signs, we can see that the female is at the forehead and the cheek. So the point is that linguistic systems, they do have some application in terms of what things mean within a culture. Now, putting all of that aside, I'm going to become more of a linguist here. And it is very difficult to figure out the differences here. What is more marked? So if something, a form that has been derived from a metonymic schema. Now, what do you think about if you're looking at what is more marked if you're seeing something at the forehead and the cheek? And I don't know, because really I think that both of them should be more marked. What should be more, I don't really know. But one good example is Afghan signs. And so you look for the sign of woman that is taken, mother, the sign for mother, all right, and then adding the shoulder makes it a woman. So here, we look at this here, and we look at the sign for a boy, and it's on one side of the body, right there. And so it's conceptual, or contralateral, I'm afraid. It's what I mean, is contralateral. Female is bilateral. And so it's very interesting there if I look at these 40 different sign language and looking at kinship terms, there was really just this one that was using the body as well as areas on the head. So it apparently is quite rare to do it that way, but I do have a Danish friend, and in terms of kinship terms, they do use the body, but how it's used right here was really quite rare in my study of the 40 different sign languages. So I have no idea. I don't have any idea why it's unilateral to bilateral on the body. So there's a lot more research to be done on that. Now, I do think that this is very significant. So signs for women and men are variable. It can be at the face, at the head area there, it can be at the body. However, kinship signs for father and mother, really, it just seems to happen right here at the face. And I found this fascinating because you discuss this with people and you try to derive some kind of application that we can expand on that. But really, when you look at signs for mother and father, it's typically always at the head there. Why is that? It's a really interesting question. There's been some hypotheses, but nothing particularly. So I throw that question out to you. Now I'm going to sum it up a little bit for you. Okay. In ASL, if you are learning ASL, and we have finger spelling, we have initialized signs following the letters forming starting the signs. And so we need to take a look at that. How is marked or finger spelling and character writing and initialization and phonemic representations in ASL kin terms? How are they being used within a manual system? and because they're not really phonemic. And so we've continually said that, they're foreign and they're really not a part of it. But if there are these terms and one of the most basic meaning groups within language, then come on, how can it be foreign? How can this concept be foreign? There's really contradicts everything that we have. If so, we have to throw all the papers that we've done thus far and just throw them out. So we've got some problems here. So, remember, as we learn, that affects theory. Now, this Brazilian sign for father. So we see the mustache sign here. And PAI, what does that mean? I don't really know. And then in Chinese, character representation for father. And it's like this. Now, this is really, there's a lot of variation to be had right here. But what I have noticed with the initialized signs with regard to Chinese, we have the sign for son, or grandson. And you'll notice that this represents the X. That's the literal translate X there. So child. In Chinese, they have these two various systems, the characterization systems as well as and so whether it's the characterization or it's pinyin, I have no idea which way it goes. But again, the problem is if you want to talk about structural complexity, you need to have some criteria that can answer these questions. And we keep saying, well, I'm not sure, there's challenges out there, but it does provide some interesting research for us. So we can see, most importantly, their initialized signs are very, it happens in many languages there, that they're using the initialized signs. So the first column there, that is more than 50%. They have an initialization overlap there. And then the middle is 1 to 49%, not quite half. And then no initialization in the third column there. But if in Ireland, we're looking at 15 to 16 initial languages. So an initialization, is that really foreign? Is that part of a sign system? Can it be marked? So that's my argument there. I don't think so. Now, this here is Greenberg's proposal. Supposing we see initialization that is happening in nuclear kin terms and the non-nuclear kin terms as well, we can make some predictions with that. And we see that it comes up in ASL, Chinese, French. There's quite a number of languages there, but it's really kind of odd because then if we look over here, it's the opposite. And what does that mean? If we propose, what does it mean if we're seeing that in British and other languages that they are not using that? So when we have this, it makes sense because husband-sister is more, it's closer in kinship. And these, I forgot a couple of comments here I wanted to make. So if you look here in the Danish, you look at Danish Sign Language there. So, and Bulgarian Sign Language is similar to that. And so when you look at the initialized sign, it kind of makes sense. You look at there's some the ant, with T here, so, and then we look at it over here, and she is finger spelling nice, and that's for cousin. So, I mean, I'm not really sure S and C if they have similar sounds to them, but the handshake there, we see that there's a vowel default in the vowel. Danish use a lot of phonemic systems in their language, finger spelling frequently. So maybe we really have to have I realize we have a limited understanding of function and form when we look at these various systems. So I'm not exactly clear myself, but the point is that the terms can, whether they're marked or not, but I just think we have to be really careful in how we're looking at them from other sign languages. So I think it's strange, British ASL, if you take a look at that, because mother and father have initialized signs. So N right here, you're using N. So, and F for father there. So F and M, yes. Yeah, so I don't know, do they call their parents F and M? I don't know, I'm just joking. But, it's very interesting that that sign for sister and brother are not initialized. So I just think that's an interesting phenomenon there. Mother and father are supposed to be the most, the closest relationship signs, kinship signs of all of them, but there's no initialization there. It's the opposite in terms of having brother and sister. So, anyways. I'm kind of jumping around here because I don't want you to stay too long. We need to have a little bit of alcohol after this tonight, so I want to give us time for that. So now, I want you to all think about the various things that I've thrown out with regarding problems related to markedness and structural complexity. And if we can figure out the criteria for structural complexity, then we can figure out the criteria for the typological markedness. But I think that we have to be more aware. We really need to ignore function. If you're doing some reading, maybe 100,000 papers are written on sign language, but you will realize very quickly that you don't need to have more than a few papers to realize that we don't discuss semantics with relation to function. We just talk about form. And form is very interesting, but is it helpful? We need to understand function better to know what's really going on within the linguistic system. And number two, I do think that there's abstractness. So in the field of sign language studies and linguistics, we need to discuss that schematization. There is an ongoing discussion, yes, and we do talk about this, but what is schematization in terms of structure, and how do we produce things holistically from there? Because we can see that schematization is really important in terms of sign languages. And what we see all the time, that it can be hard to actually control that because there's some theoretical problems there. So, and that's why I'm here. Really, I am trying to address and answer in various ways some of these questions that are coming up, and I'm hoping to hear from some of you about that. And then further research needed, yes, I always need to say that, and acknowledgments. I could not have done this work without so many people And they all really, there were so many names, I think it would have hurt your eyes if I had written them all down. But I do want to let you know that I got quite a bit of help with my work. So I am now finished and open for your questions.
Questions? Just a quick question about, so all of this information left me wondering if there is if there's any common gesture at all throughout any of the languages, like, or,
Well, knowing and hearing that people live together and we coexist and we share gestures, of course, so, and it's true.
Would you say that there is at all, I guess, what's the most common gesture, if there is one?
Well, I don't know because, we're here in Davis, and so the most common gesture that may not be the same if we were to go over, 2,000 kilometers from here, I don't know. I can tell you, I can answer that. Maybe, we forget, like in our face and a function as gestures, with our eyebrows, like we're going to invite somebody, that we have that. It's affective, but also to invite some openness. So again, it's a good question. Thank you. I'm not sure who it was.
It's just to, sorry, thank you, Dr. Erin. It's just to clarify the question. I believe what my colleague is really asking is if there is any commonality across signs as opposed to gestures. So the question really is with respect to the sign hand movement.
I haven't seen, I haven't seen everything in the world, so I couldn't answer that question. But I do want to be clear. Is sign language universal? And the answer is no. We don't have a universal sign language that is understood over the world. There are variations or different languages, but what parts of structure that we may see common, is all gestures use hands and faces and bodies to communicate, of course. But specific examples or specific signs, I have no idea. I wish I had all the time to travel. Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious about whether there are parallels between the complexity of kinship terms.
I'm asking whether there are parallels between the kinship terms in sign languages in the same culture as spoken languages. I'm not sure I made that clear. But I mean, the more complex the system in a sign language, does that reflect complexity in the same spoken language in the same area? Or is it possible to have a real dissociation there?
Great. That's a very wonderful question. And there are two important parts. So all of this I presented, I have no idea about the function. I don't know how deaf people really use kin term. It was references. They suggest they use all of them, but based on my personal observations and what I've heard from deaf people is they use less references to than hearing people within the same community. but again, I don't know. So that means, like, for example, in ASL, in American Sign Language, generally we have ASL and English. There are, some similar terms, like with kin terms, or there's a notation of, and that's the term cousin. So if I say the word cousin, it does not specify gender. It's just, in ASL, we can depict whether the cousin is a female cousin or a male cousin by the location lower on the face or higher on the forehead. However, there are some sign languages and there are some spoken languages where kin systems are actually congruent. So I don't know, so I can't answer, but my guess is probably it is not equivalent in communities of here in Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I've been in my own research interested in these reversals of markedness or apparent reversals of markedness that seem to pop up, right? And so maybe a quick suggestion may help disentangle some of these interesting facts.
Oh, sure, I love that.
So you said, I think, that in the use of initialization to compose some signs, that you see initialization in the non-nuclear term, and that implies initialization in the nuclear term, reversing the nuclear to non-nuclear implication, right?
Yes. If the nuclear term is that we can predict the non-nuclear term, with the iconicity.
Okay.
With the initialization.
Thank you. So there's a well-known case in syntax where a markedness hierarchy in grammatical relations is reversed. And that is the use of resumptive pronouns in relative clauses. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the use of a resumptive pronoun on an oblique, for instance, it implies the use of a resumptive pronoun in a non-oblique function going against the Keenan-Hombre hierarchy. And Bernard can probably confirm that that's the case. I'm sure it is. So, and the idea seems to be...
I'll think about that, me too.
The idea seems to be that relativizing over an oblique is more costly to processing, therefore we're more likely to have the resumptive pronoun as a sort of helping strategy.
And that makes sense.
So could it be that in this case the use of an initialization design works as a helping strategy to process the more marked term in the opposition?
It's possible. I'm playing with that idea. It's possible. Thank you.
Well,
Yes.
Thank you. So for some of these sources, or for some of these ways of analyzing markedness, it has to be internal to the language, that you're looking within the terms of the language to see which are more and less marked. But then there are also potentially these really simplistic but maybe also useful ways of talking about markedness, like just a term is longer than another, or I can imagine that also in the case of sign language you have things about what articulators are involved that are going to be more or less just physically effortful. And so I'm wondering to what extent you think those might be, because they're so simplistic, maybe they're actually easier to characterize, and to what extent you think that might be a useful path forward.
Well, again, it's a spiral. We can go round and round asking those questions. It's arbitrary, which is easier. Yes, it makes sense. It's less markedness. But the problem is that we're not completely sure of exactly what is easy to form, what is easy to see. So it's a complex problem because we must see it. So, and the second problem is that, for example, this is 2 minutes of nothing, but you ready? Okay. This is the worst handshake to me. Because I warn everybody in my linguistics class to never, never, never use this, because this means like the middle finger. Okay. This is easy. This is easy, but again, another problem is that some types of cultures or to say, or cultural taboo, or whatever you might want to call it, we really don't know much about that. There are different parts that contribute to this discussion. The phonological, is it easily formulated, is it visual, is it receptive, is it morphological, that idea, it's really, we need more discussion. So, thank you. Are there any more questions? Oh, wow. Okay, 2 more.
Hi, thanks. I was just wondering, what was like the genetic affiliation between the different languages that you showed us, and whether or not the amount of kinship terms was correlated to the genetic affiliation of the language, as opposed to maybe the cultures that use the language.
Well, okay. I want to make it clear that any discussion related with historical development of sign languages is just like, well, let's look for the genie in the bottle. I mean, it's impossible, and we would love to, I know we would love to, but it's impossible because there's real no documentation. Like I said, it's very limited. I mean, the potential, of assumptions, and so significant link if you want to call it, but, with sign languages, they quickly can die out, but we also know they can very quickly grow. They can emerge. So if we can look to the genes of sign languages and how exactly it happens and what type of structure and how it evolves and how it's ongoing, and then we have access to that. That's part of it, but it's ongoing, and there's, we have some ideas about that type of sign language compared with ASL, with, it's an older language, I mean, but it also is evolved as well, those patterns that we see. But again, unfortunately, when we're talking about genetic history of language, really, it's more than 50, 60 years. It's difficult because it's so difficult. There's so little documentation. I think there was one more hand. Oh, there you were.
Thank you. I just had a question, I guess, bringing function more into it. Is there any difference between kin terms that are speaking directly to the person, like mommy, for example, versus speaking about the relative?
Okay. So I know for sure in American Sign Language, and some sign languages have, I'm familiar using personally. So I can't generalize to all sign languages. But, what also I've seen is the vocative function, calling attention to an individual as using a kin term in sign language is not, it's not existent. How we get attention is we will tap on the body. We don't have to use that kin term because we don't yell it out, because once somebody looks and they see my waving hand, I've already called their attention. So it seems like there's more agreement and more acceptance. So I'm also wondering, with deaf people, with deaf signers compared to hearing signers. Hearing signers are a little bit more complicated because how they use language is much more complicated. But deaf people, I'm wondering, do they use references to family members? Okay, so I have a question. So, my husband is from Turkey, and in his family, they're from a village, and their last name, the village, that name. Okay, so I remember meeting like 100 relatives in 1 week, and I was like, what? Oh my goodness. Okay. My problem was that all of them know how they are all related. However, but I see my husband and his brother, who is deaf, and also his partner is deaf, and how they refer to the family members. Most of the time, it is non-using kin terms. So sometimes talking about, third cousins or like remote family relatives, I ask, do you know how you two are related? And I might say, I know from my father's side, but I don't know my grandmother's brother or my grandfather's sister. They can't figure out and determine exactly. However, the important is the cultural system here is we don't have that idea, that same idea. In Turkey, it is quite, there's not the remoteness, but just as in references and seeing how they use it, it's a more complex system within their family that they don't use. But it's possible that other families do. But I haven't seen it, so I don't know. But in Nepal, they have, like I said, 58 kin terms. So do deaf children always know how all the family members are related? Maybe not. So I question that. And quite often, our knowledge seems like families don't always explain, especially if they're from a hearing family who does not sign. They may not explain to the child how this person is related to me by this and this and this. From your grandfather or sister. I don't know. So I don't know. But again, the point is to function, and that's something that we need to research more, and that's what's very critical. Is that it? Oh, is there one more? Oh, back to you.
One more question.
If I get to ask two, since we have time. In this culture these days, in the spoken language, we're moving away from a sense of binary and considering using the pronoun they or a set of other possible pronouns that respect people who don't subscribe to the gender binary. It occurred to me listening to your talk that I use words like aunt and uncle unthinkingly, mother and father, brother and sister, but somehow when I hear about a language or a set of languages I don't know, gender all of a sudden becomes very salient, and particularly with respect to this gender binary. I assume these discussions are going on in communities that have the gendered kinship terms you're talking about. Some of those communities already have terms in the spoken languages for people who are neither he nor she. Is that correct? And is that going to be reflected in the kinship terms as well?
It's possible. It's possible. I don't know myself exactly, but it's possible. What we know is that languages and communities evolve, beliefs and cultures and ideas evolve, and then languages is somehow they evolve. However, we already know that kin terms are one of the most just entrenched parts of languages and systems. So the structure in itself, I don't know. It's slow to change. However, it is possible that the idea that our perspectives will also change, and we'll figure out how to handle that, but I don't know what will happen. So we can wait and see what happens in the future. It is very exciting time. Okay, cool, we're good.
Let's thank our speaker again.
Awesome, thank you so much for coming this evening.
And then we can all head over to the Alumni Center for the reception.